In response to a question about Europe's colonization of Africa, he answers this about the colonizers. They've never invented anything to make Earth habitable. Everything they do is to destroy the land. After this, he gestures silently. The interviewer, in turn, gestures silently. After a long pause, the scene closes. What more needed to be said anyways? Everything they do is to destroy the land. I've leaned in for a few days now to your gentle but firm insistence that the abolition of police and prisons must be a pillar of decolonization, and that Indigenous land-based struggles could, should, must be considered within what abolition demands of us. Land back. Land back. I'm going to finish with a reading from the end of the chapter. There are better ways to be in relation with one another and with the land. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this to you, but I've been gardening for the first time. I have the great fortune of renting the first floor of an affordable, if for Toronto, if run down and slightly moldy house with a backyard, a rarity in Toronto these days. In late spring, I planted squash, corn, and beans. I was taught to plant this combination of vegetables by Candace Eskimo, who every year, near the Humber River, teaches the land-based programming for Black and Afro-Indigenous Freedom School kids, and by proxy, their parents. I still had no idea what I was doing as I covered the planting area with compost and embedded the seeds, supplementing my learnings with WikiHow, 1 centimeter deep into the soil. The corn was immediately eaten by squirrels, despite my best efforts. Yet now that the full heat and humidity of summer is here, the massive leaves of the squash plant have climbed up and around the yard, have taken over the spaces I have tentatively allotted to flowers. They have climbed up my small square of patio and captured my bike, have woven into my rusty barbecue, rendering it for now unusable, but I don't mind. I would never have imagined that so much lush, leafy greenery was part of producing these dense and chubby root vegetables. The vines from the bean plants climbed up the walls of the house. It took me a while to catch on that actual beans were growing, hidden as they were behind the leaves. They were mysterious to me for the first few weeks when they started coming in, until my son Lamar pointed out their presence to me. Despite my elderly Portuguese neighbors inexplicably burning their garbage in the barbecue twice a week, making the outdoor space less than palatable at times, this unexpected urban savanna that I've somehow facilitated serves as a reminder that I am part of and reside not only in this city, but on a living planet, in a mini ecosystem of me, Lamar, these plants, and the skunks and raccoons that live in the landlord's shed behind my house. This has helped remind me, too, that I am people of the lands, that if everything they do is to destroy the land, I can choose, still, an alternate path, to support a return of forms of land stewardship that are amenable to a habitable earth, to render things habitable, once again, in the human sense as well. No settlers or cages, land back. It is, anyways, in looking to this swath of unchecked and improvised plant life that has exploded across my small square of yard, that I can listen to the vegetation. The curling vines seem to whisper quietly that we can shake off these brutal, if enduring, forms of land valuation, that the land's value has, can, and will again be divorced from the violence of surplus value and the other ignoble measures of our times. As I carefully remove the aphids from the leaves of the green beans pressed against my crumbling red brick walls, they murmur, with words barely audible under the sounds of the traffic on Bloor. For the earth to live, capitalism must die. It's getting to be harvesting time. If I thought there was a realistic chance of us seeing one another face to face anytime soon, I would set aside one of the squash for you. I would offer this small gesture of the earth's gifts so that we could feed our families together with some of the products of the summer of revolt, and let this nurture us for the difficult months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually laughed out loud at the neighbor burning garbage part, because I too had that neighbor in Toronto. And I'm wondering, the squash, you talk about wanting to share it. If only we could have been together. What did you do with it?
I believe that squash I ended up cooking for myself and for Lamar, because Leanne and I actually were only able to finally break bread just a few months ago, finally, and we shared a beautiful meal, and I was able to pass on both some Star Trek coasters, which when you read the book you'll see has an important connotation between us, and another squash.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to start with maybe the most obvious question, but I'm very, very curious. You chose to write this book together in a series of letters. And it starts with a letter that was written before everything changed. And I was brought back to a letter that I wrote in February 2020 where I was like, I'll see you then. This is going to be so great. And then everything changed. Writing is such an intensely personal and also like often isolating practice. And you've intentionally chosen to do something that is very, very collective with someone else. So talk a little bit about the decision of using letters as the way that you put forward this story. Sure.
So interestingly enough, absolutely. So when we started writing one another, firstly, we had no idea if it was actually going to be I think that there was no intention that it would be a book. It was really just sort of an experiment. When we met, we really connected in terms of our work, and we're already deeply connected in that way, and we wanted to build something. We didn't necessarily know what that something was, so we had this idea of perhaps writing and recording conversations, and we'd done this visit on the land where she'd brought me up to Deshinta in the Northwest Territories and done this land-based education. So we knew we were working on some kind of collective thinking, but we definitely did not anticipate it was a book of letters. And without Dion Brand very gently but firmly nudging us into the idea that these letters should actually become a book, I think that it very likely could have been a zine or lived in Gmail documents forever. So really grateful that it ended up sort of turning into something that now is like gets to live in the public too, as well. So when I first wrote Leanne, it was before the pandemic. So it seemed like one way of reaching out amongst many others, because at that time we weren't living in a period of isolation. And when I start the book to her, I'm trying to break that isolating feeling of doom scrolling the climate crisis, the crisis of policing, the crisis of prisons, and just trying to find a way to relate, to reach out to somebody else. And then what ended up being, of course, was these stay-at-home orders, was being at home with your children, with, for many of us who were able, of course, to actually be part of the stay-at-home orders. There are many others, many particularly Black, Indigenous people who were not able to do so, right? But to be in this period of isolation, reaching out through letters actually became a way of having a collective place to like live together, to think together. It ended up being, I think, for both of us, a way that we managed to sort of spiritually hold ourselves and hold one another. And we often talk about it as being a place that, like a world that we lived in together at this time. So as opposed to thinking about the multiple crises of the time that we're facing with the climate catastrophe and so much else, it ended up being a place to process all of these crises and their historical antecedents, but also a way to really think about how to build another kind of world by doing so at this micro level, by actually building this little home space to share. So we often talk about how now we really miss sort of living in the book. And I find myself, after the Buffalo shootings, for example, still just my go-to is to write, Dear Leanne. It really became a place that we could help sort of co-create an understanding of what was going on around us. So I'm really glad that it ended up turning into this book, which wasn't necessarily part of the vision at the time. It was really just about surviving and co-resisting and thinking about survival in a planetary sense. So this is one path that thinking together ended up taking.
Mm. And I was also really struck by how well your writing styles complement one another. Because I mean, I could find myself in a letter and I knew who was writing by about letter 4 or 5. Like there was just this incredible interplay between your words and between your ideas. And then that letter structure really is kind of like Lego. You build a line, she builds a line, you're able to build a line on top of that, and then bring us from what starts off as doom scrolling and pessimistic and worried and all the feelings that we've all felt, that turns into something that isn't exactly hopeful, but that has a vision for the future that is livable, more just, more solidaristic, and eventually the future of our dreams.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Both of us are in a situation where we're often asked if we're optimistic or pessimistic, and I think the answer is both, always, all the time, right? And I think that's very much true within these pages. That's very much true within our personalities, and also that's very much something that resonates in the writing. So I think there's something I think that comes from a place of trying to be humble, of trying to think about what it means to be coming into what in many ways feels apocalyptic in terms of the rising seas and massive famines that are being predicted, by climate scientists, but also thinking about the fact that our ancestors, that Black and Indigenous people have lived through multiple apocalyptic events already. Right, that enslavement and kidnapping 15 million Africans from the west shores of Africa was itself a kind of apocalypse. Being placed on boats and in change in North America was its own kind of apocalypse. That for Indigenous people, 95% of Indigenous peoples in the Americas, being killed at the advent of European colonization. That these were apocalyptic events as well. So we're really descended from these traditions. You have people who, despite coming up against really apocalyptic life structures, nonetheless created worlds to live in anyway, for themselves, for their children. They fought back in organized ways, in terms of anti-colonial struggle, in terms of the struggle for the abolition of slavery, but also fought back in terms of how they kept their families together, in terms of how they thought about land outside of the imposition of capitalism, right? So it's to say, I think that it's not sort of a naive optimism, but it's just this idea that, people have survived horrendous kinds of violence and continued to build more livable futures. So it's sort of trying to take that very seriously, that inheritance, and try to do justice to it, despite not feeling particularly, again, naively optimistic about the conditions that we're facing in the world today. Mm-hmm. So I'm not one of those people that, there are people looking at when the pandemic happened and said, look, this is what, capitalism is ending, it's over. And, we very much saw, though it was an incredibly exciting time in terms of protest, in terms of real revolutionary Black-led uprisings across the country, we also, are very aware, I'm very aware of the realities that, the forces that govern the world today are absolutely tightening their hold, if anything, on the planet, on extraction, on expanding policing and incarceration over and over again. So trying to keep a hope in that context feels absolutely crucial. And Mariam Kaba says, hope is a discipline. And I think that's something that's really helpful, because you actually have to just make yourself do it, even the days that you don't want to, even the days that you have to go to a meeting and it's just going to be frustrating and conflict, but you just sort of have to do it because you have to embed yourself in the possibility that maybe this time you never know what actions, like what will happen as the result of your actions, but to just say act in every moment as if possibly this could be the moment that would help contribute to a more liberated future.
This book is part of a new class of literature that is post-COVID. We're not post-COVID, but it's post the shock of the pandemic. Yeah. And COVID looms large, obviously, in the conversation that you have, but it doesn't take over either. And there's a lot of sobriety reminding us that that COVID simply exacerbated things that have already been true and have been true for a very long time in colonized parts of the world. Talk to us a little bit about what it's like to write during a pandemic and what it's like to try and bring that sense into your writing while you're also trying to process it in real time.
I think that writing through a pandemic, as a writer, I think that writing is how I process the world around me. So I think that writing was, for me, the only way to sort of intellectually and spiritually move through that time. I think that it's a way that allows us to reflect not only in this reactive moment to what's happening around you and the crises facing, Black populations in Toronto, Indigenous communities in the North, but to also, I think in writing, for me at least, I'm always trying to give myself kind of a history of the present to say, how did this come to be? Dion Brand describes COVID as an X-ray of the racial and economic and gendered kind of injustices that had already permeated our society. So I think that in writing, you're able to sort of extrapolate how you have arrived here, and also it helps remind you, because writing also has this future tense that you need to orient yourself towards what next, right? Having a conversation or living your day-to-day, you're not necessarily oriented that way. So for me, writing is a helpful exercise to actually process, and it's kind of a survival mechanism. I actually wrote Policing Black Lives, for example, when my son was a baby, and it was the first Black Lives Matter movement. And again, it was both a time of enormous possibility, but also it was a very frightening time of these of these arrests of Black protesters and all of this. And I remember just writing that as a way to try to contribute something while having a young baby to this movement in this moment, but also really as a way of just helping to make sense of what was happening, and again, to try to imagine something more emancipatory than that. So I think it's like a way, for me, for writing is a sort of a practice that helps sort out, that helps me to de-present, I guess, the present, to say that there's nothing that's happening now that we can't, that we can't just extract it from its own history. We can't look at something like the COVID pandemic and the grossly disproportionate impacts it had on Black people, on Indigenous people, on people living with disabilities without understanding the history of slavery, of settler colonialism, right? That we couldn't understand also, the massive protest movement that happened during COVID. Black Lives Matter 2.0, I often think about it, right? That these massive Black-led uprisings that were historic in the streets were also part of a much longer trajectory from Black people fighting enslavement to the Black liberation movement to Black anti-colonial struggle. So everything becomes more legible to us. And I think we can see ourselves also as actors in a historical moment when we think about it that way. So that's, in a loose sense, I think how writing helps me to embed myself, maybe to be more grounded, to be more present, as opposed to just sort of living through it, you know?
Well, in that presence, it's so interesting because I found it so difficult during the pandemic to remind myself of that future tense, to know that, I'm writing in November 2020 and I have no idea what June 2022 looks like. Yeah. And what I could be saying in November 2020 might be almost on point, or it could be completely way off because we've got this whole future ahead of us that we help influence, but we don't control. Yeah. So talk a little bit about that temporal kind of challenge when you're in the moment of this situation, knowing that you're writing past it.
I think what was really helpful for us in terms of not putting that pressure on ourselves, it was even as we were writing it, we weren't 100% convinced throughout the entire period that it would be a book. So like especially when we started the project and it wasn't a pandemic, we'd already sort of made this commitment. So I think that in some ways that sort of helped to remove that. But I don't know. In some ways, some of the work that we were doing that was future-oriented was thinking about, these grave historical injustices. So, of course, it would be amazing if by the time the book had come out that, the Indigenous land struggles were no longer, I think it would be wonderful if this book was obsolete, right? By the time it came out, if that meant that, for example, police had been defunded across Canada, that we'd begun, that the peoples inhabiting here had begun mass land-based restoration. So, of course, that would be incredible if this was instead sort of a time capsule on a less just moment. I think that would be the most ideal situation in some ways, right? But otherwise, short of that, I think that given trying to embed the crisis of the COVID pandemic within this long delay of slavery and settler colonialism, because it was about the present, but it was very much about historicizing the present. So I think that longer history, doesn't move, whether the needle is 2020, 2025, 2030. It just sort of, I think it's nice to embed yourself within one moment and just let it take up all the space that it does without knowing, and just to trust that it will land somewhere and hopefully be helpful for movements, for people thinking about freedom. And of course you never really know, but I think if you're really I'm sure it was the same for you, as you're just trying to write with the best sense of integrity that you can, and hope that if you do your justice to that and to the people that you're writing with and thinking with and the communities that you care about, that regardless of whether or not it's still sort of relevant exactly, it would also be amazing if the pandemic was over at this time, right? And if COVID-19 was gone, but again, that's not true. So I think it's just a sense of maybe trust and not letting that sort of panic, I think, that we all always feel about the future, not letting that part of you win,
right?
in terms of the writing. It's always there, and I think we all hold that, and then just trying to ground yourself as well.
Yes. Now, just so everybody watching knows, we are going to take questions closer to the end of the talk. So get those questions in your mind, line them up. Maybe I'll ask them if you think really hard, and it'll just get to my brain. But in case not, you'll have the chance at the end of the talk to ask a couple of questions. One of the images in the book that is so strong, it's stated explicitly in some cases, and it's just obvious. It's implicitly obvious, is the importance of networking, of networked existence, not networking. I mean, whatever. And so often the word web is used several times, and then the way that this book is like a set of letters and an encyclopedia. It is such. I have to. You don't know this, but when I was writing "Take Back the Fight," I had to do my index, and they were like, "Well, here's Robyn's index from the police book." I was like, "Okay," and I looked at it. I was like, "I am daunted by this index. It is so long and amazing and thorough." And the same kind of thoroughness is in these letters, which is so interesting because they're personal and conversational. But the networked connections with thinking theorists who are alive, theorists who have passed, the work of radical Black activists and philosophers and Indigenous philosophers and writers and activists. It's all in this book, and it's really amazing. And then the network of our relations with one another, our relations with the land, our relations with the air and the water. And that's how it ends, is this really wonderful and evocative passage from Leanne about water. So talk to us a little bit about the importance of you referencing other people, reminding us about other people, and then gathering all of this like snapshot into this moment in time.
Thanks so much for that question. And I did not know that about the Policing Black Lives Index, which I did not do myself, just to be clear. I've never made an index before, maybe one day. So
No, don't ever do it.
Yeah.
No, it's the worst.
It seemed like a horrifying task.
I did it, and then I never did it again.
Yeah, it's true. Maybe I hope to never do an index, but I very much respect you for having taken this on. So that's very amazing. We'll give an extra round of applause for Nora at the end. But so for this book, something that's so important to me, as somebody that comes from movements, right? I'm somebody who's sort of more lately shifted into academia, but I'm somebody who started writing as a journalist, doing grassroots or community organizing, doing grassroots community radio, talking and thinking with, people who are on the front lines of struggle, right? And I think that it's really important for me as a thinker, as a writer, to acknowledge where knowledge comes from and to move away from this one great man having an idea narrative, the patriarchal model of writing and knowledge that tells us that change comes from one thinker having an incredible idea and forwarding it, and then the masses take it up and make these shifts, right? Or that these really important ideas around fighting slavery, fighting colonialism, as if these were the product of one person, right? I think that's a very masculinist way of thinking about intellectual work. That's a really, especially I think that's a really damaging way when we think about freedom work, because everything really vital that happens, all the shifts that we see in our city, across our society, happen from collective labor. So for me, writing is a way to acknowledge and name that. And I think that as opposed to actually making us look lesser, I think it's a really deeper way of engaging, in an honest way where thinking happens. So something that, that I think I really tried to bring into the text is that what was happening, we're not articulating to each other our one solo vision for, say, like what Black freedom could mean in the context of a pandemic and a climate crisis, but to say, look at the incredible work that is happening in encampments where Black people are refusing to leave their homes. That idea of what it means to demand that you deserve the right to stay in the city. That's not an idea that could come from that's not an idea that could come independently or from academia or from anybody from the outside. But that idea, that insistence that people deserve to have a home, comes from people who are insisting that they deserve to have a home in their own lives, right? So that's an idea that one can't take credit for, or one could, but shouldn't. Right, and I think that it's really important to look at, the kinds of ideas that were coming out of movements of people who are looking, for example, to end the violence of police and policing. That a lot of this was people who've experienced the harms of policing firsthand, who are coming from policed communities, who have experienced gender-based violence and are trying to find alternative systems, because we know if you're Black or Indigenous and call for help, in the context of violence, that you will often instead deal with harm or worse. Right? So I think it's just really important to acknowledge who are the thinkers of our times, and that those thinkers are actually disparate, that those thinkers are actually all around us, and that the freedom work that's happening that's the most exciting is happening often in community centers, in kitchens, where people are sort of whispering out their plans, for the next disruption. Right? So I think it's a matter of just really crediting and thinking alongside, right? I think in trying to be generous and thinking alongside and not, trying to front that any one person can really be the one, person that could sum up an entire tradition, say a tradition of Black radical thinking. That tradition has always been large masses of people refusing and fighting back in these different ways. And I think that's actually really inspiring, and it actually ends up being kaleidoscopic, because you could write a book. I sometimes actually think about this, like what it would actually mean to try to just write all of these different portraits. Like it could never end, right? You could have a 2,000-page book that I think would be beautiful to read. That would just be about different tiny like wins and setbacks across movements, across different places, right? And that's some of the most exciting thinking and acting that is happening. So I just want to try to do justice to that.
And you're right. It's these small wins that somehow seem like everything, which I have a love-hate relationship with the small wins, but it's mostly love, You know, so when I read that, I was like, okay, I got to write that down. One of the themes as well, and it's explicitly stated, but not, but the most powerful parts is when it's implied, is the dead end of reform. And you wrote, on reform, we have tried and we have been tried, which is another one of these lines in the book that are so powerful and so pithy. What do you think it's going to take to convince as many people as possible that the reforms are a dead end and that they're a distraction? And talk a little bit about where the revolutionary ideas, which are so present in this book, really drove this project forward. Because it seems to me like that's really the impetus to continue to get us to the point at the end of thinking of different futures.
Absolutely. So I'll answer that question in two ways. The first thing I want to say is that I actually think that this question you're asking about what would it take to convince these large numbers of people, I think that 2020 showed us that large swaths of people, especially of Black and working class communities, of migrant communities, of Indigenous communities, of white, of white people really starting to see and understand the legacies of racism and racial violence, and deciding even if we didn't see institutional wins, I think there was a really important cultural shift in terms of what happened, in terms of people understanding that countries like Canada and the United States have been foundationally structured around lines of anti-Blackness against Indigenous communities, and really taking that seriously. So I think that we shouldn't take for granted how important that shift actually was. And something else that I think shows us that we've had this kind of shift is if we look at the demands between sort of the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement, where Trayvon Martin was killed, you often saw this chant that was the whole damn, what was it? The whole damn system is guilty as hell. Indict, convict, send those killer cops to jail. People may remember that from the Streets for Movement. And then we move in to 2020, and we actually see that the demands have changed, that people are not out in the streets demanding justice in an abstract way. People are not out in the streets demanding, send police to jail too. People were out in the streets saying, we need to shift funding away from police and policing and put money into community housing and put money into safe transportation and put money into non-police options for people in a mental health crisis. So we actually have an incredible precision coming out of this broader call 5 years back for justice, and actually saying this is what justice looks like. We actually can't look towards policing and prisons as a way to solve our way out of the crisis of Black people being continuously killed and profiled by the police, of Indigenous young women dying at the hands of police, and a wellness check to say that we actually need to do something far larger, defunding the police, abolition. These moved into the mainstream register, and I just think that that is actually something that is so incredibly powerful that I don't take for granted. I think it shifted the kind of society that we live in, that took for granted that we had to keep the institutions that we were born with, and people started to see the possibility that we could do something else, that we deserve something more than this, and we can ask for it and we can demand that, actually. So I think that I feel, even though, again, we've seen, across cities, despite the extreme popularity of moving away from policing and moving towards a care-based society, politicians have not done that, right? So we continue to see John Tory, we continue to see across cities in North America, right, more funding for police, even though often more than half of the population supports cutting funding, right? So the institutions have not yet responded, despite being shook at this moment, perhaps having to do something symbolic, having to take the knee. Right? They'll take the knee, then give an apology, and we have not actually seen that institutional change. But people were awoken to something, and to a sense, and I think a belief that they could actually do something different and demand something different. And I don't think that 2 years of neglectful and disdainful responses by the political class would be enough to change that, or enough to undo that. That was a moment of political education that showed. Walter Rodney says another world is necessary. And I think that more people than ever at this time do believe that, especially as we move into, a climate crisis that is also a crisis of policing, that is also a crisis of homelessness and displacement in this city and across North America, right? So I think that the next step is, of course, what are we going to do about it? And that continues to be an important question. That
Which was going to be the next question, although I don't want to put you right on the spot. Maybe talk about some of those examples in the book of really inspiring movements that are that you're taking inspiration from it, and you think that everyone needs to be looking for cues or ideas or strategy?
Sure. So, something, I think that COVID showed us something, which is that so many ideas and things that we have been continuously told were impossible were actually just a matter of political choice and political will, right? So suddenly, in the context of a pandemic, it was made possible, as it should have been, as it should always have been, for people who did not have enough money to live their lives to have a decent monthly income so that they could afford to pay their rent, right? So this was always an impossible pipe dream. Activists were told, like, shut up, that's unimaginable. But it actually turned out that, it was always possible to do this. Something else that also happened in the context of the pandemic was because of the public health crisis of carceral settings that we actually saw a significant release of detainees. And there was a massive hunger strike, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, led by Black migrants largely, people in detention going on hunger strike, demanding, that they be liberated in the context of public health, but also saying, it's already a health crisis for people to be behind bars. We should always already have been released. So this release showed us, again, that if we could have already had our community members back home, then that's something that as a society we could always still be demanding, that it's always an emergency, it's always a public health emergency to have human beings living in cages, right? But it also showed us that with enough political will, we could actually just immediately, literally overnight, change that. So I think that's something that's incredibly powerful. Something else that I think we often don't take for granted, that we shouldn't take for granted, is the fact that policing in schools and the fact that law enforcement officers should be in, in educational settings, despite horrific incidents like the 6-year-old Black girl who was handcuffed in her school. What young people have showed us around the country, of course, first Black Lives Matter Toronto and Latin and others in Toronto, in this movement to get police officers out of schools, and then the largely Black and racialized teenagers who did the same thing in Hamilton. And then we see this movement across in Edmonton, in Vancouver, that we're seeing a movement where students and Black parents and other parents and supporters saying, of course there should not be police in our schools. Of course we should actually just have guidance counselors. We should have things that young people actually need. We should have things that keep young people safe. So I think this is something that had been taken for granted, that due to one strong community organizing has then led to this windfall, where now we've actually seen police being pulled from schools and from schooling all across, in many, many schools across Canada and across North America. So again, something that we thought might have been impossible was actually accomplished, and then accomplished and again across borders, and is now something that is, I think, really making young students anywhere realize that we don't have to be afraid in our schools. We don't have to have armed law officers in our school. We could actually be nurtured. We could actually be safe. And that shows us that, again, from a few small meetings, right, and a few upset parents and family members and teachers, often you can see this massive ripple. And there's no way that they could have foreseen, the people who were first organizing against this, what would have happened internationally, right? So I think, again, that allows us to see that we can change the conditions around us, that it's happening all the time. You never know if what you're doing will be that linchpin, but you have to act as if it is, just in case, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
This is the last question before I ask questions from the audience. There's a silent character in the book, and it's called Zoom. There's a lot of reference to Zoom meetings and Zoom sessions, and it's something I'm sure we all have this similar experience with. And it was interesting to see, it seems like the pandemic was this moment of reflection, of deep reflection and study, and the opportunity to connect with people who you're not necessarily going to see in real life because they're located all over the world. And now we're in this moment where we can, more than we were able to, see each other once again, and build those relationships that aren't mitigated by technology. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that interplay between being virtually together and then finally being together in real life, and how activism was transformed in this pandemic, as many of us had the privilege of socially isolating at home?
Sure. Something that's interesting is that I don't think Leanne and I Zoomed even once during the process of writing this book. We must have crossed over at some point, but it was definitely a relationship that lived in letters, which I think is something that felt really important. We didn't want to give that away,
Yeah.
But, much as I wish that Zoom were not sort of a corporation, I wish that there was a different way of sort of publicly being a publicly owned and safer way of being able to communicate with one another. Something for me through the pandemic was that there was also these really transformative moments about it. So I was part of, I'm still part of sort of a loose network of people who are called the Abolition Coalition, who are coordinating across different cities in Canada, trying to get support for people to be decarcerated during the COVID pandemic from jails, from prisons, and from migrant detention centers. And there were so many meetings between so many of us in that context, and I realized that I had some people over in my house in the backyard last July, and a lot of people who we'd been sort of loosely organizing through Zoom, even doing events together, in different cities, live streamed, right? So there was this incredible new network of relationships, and when a lot of the people were over, they were introducing themselves, saying, "Oh, great to meet you in person," and I hadn't even realized because there'd been so much back and forth that, like, living in these Zooms and these Google documents, that you still get that kind of deep relationship and reciprocity. So I think in one ways, I don't believe in trying to say that something good came from a pandemic, because I think that's a gross way to think about, a horrific thing that took so many lives from us. But I do think that learning how to be in communication in different ways, learning how to really coordinate with people across cities and still be able to forge relationship across vast expanses of space is something that managed to shift people's lives in really important ways that I hope we can still take away from that, and that it wouldn't take a crisis to actually realize that it's possible to do this. It's actually possible to do really powerful work with people who you have not seen,
right.
And this is, of course, not new. It's a new technology for doing this. But if I think about the kind of organizing, that somebody like Herman Bell, a political prisoner, and others, when they were incarcerated, of course, organizing community gardens, these back and forth letters, that there's always been ways, especially for people living in conditions of captivity, to forge relationships and continue to work despite even sort of physical immobilization, right? So I think that's sort of a model that shows, despite different conditions around us, you can try to wage freedom in some way from wherever you're located.
That's right.
Yeah.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, turn to the crowd. Who's itching to ask a question? Yes, of course. I think there's a microphone right here.
So, you know how the letters, at first you said you were just taking down letters that you were writing to each other? I was wondering, when did you realize that those letters were going to become a book?
Thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate that. So originally, so we had started writing. I had written Leanne this letter, again, not knowing that we were about to not see one another for a very long time. We'd planned all these trips we were going to do and all these ways we were going to think together. So I think that helped us decide to keep writing each other, as opposed to all the other things that we wanted to do but could no longer do. So we'd kept writing each other. And then actually, I really have to give credit to, my favorite poet, novelist, thinker, Dionne Brand. At sort of a fortuitous moment, I was having a conversation with her about the letters, and she was just like, "You have to publish this. This should be a book." And then I was, when Dionne Brand tells you that your writing should be a book, you listen to her. If Dionne Brand tells you to do something, you do it. So that's something, I brought that to Leanne, and we really decided at that time, you know what? Okay, this can also be that. This can be many things. So that's sort of what shifted us into definitely deciding what we were doing was going to be a book, which came from really not that. And had it been just the two of us, again, it might have been like a zine or who knows, so.
Well, and in the same vein of that question, how did the title come about? It's referenced not very often in the text.
Right?
Yep. The introduction is wonderful and helps to give some context to that. But there is definitely a theme of trying and trying this out and trying this out, which I think is really key in abolition politics. Like, it's about imagining and trying, and ooh, maybe that didn't work so well. Try that again and try that again. So talk a little bit about how the title came to be.
Sure. So, I think that it was a deliberate choice. I think we were, at least for me, at some point I was like, should we actually say what we meant by this in the book? Because at no point does it explain explicitly the concept of rehearsals for living. But what I really liked about what we were trying to do was I felt that the book was actually showing it was trying to embody what that means. It was trying to embody rehearsal, this act of rehearsing thinking with one another about what abolitionist futures could be like, of turning to rehearsals that we saw elsewhere, turning to these rehearsals for a different kind of world that we saw our ancestors taking part in. So I think it was really trying to embody it and engender it like in the text, and saying, I think it might actually take away from it to have done so in text, to say, by the way, also, So I think we were really just trying to live that idea. But I should also really mention that it took inspiration in particular from the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, whose work Golden Gulag, of course, really, I think, helped us think about what a world without prisons can and must look like, right? So she has a really important phrase where she says, abolition is life in rehearsal.
Right.
And I think what she's really getting to there is the idea that, again, sort of what we've been speaking about earlier, that people are experimenting all the time with really important, more liberatory ways of living, and that it's, freedom is not some destination that we're trying to get to that we imagine we'll arrive at, but it's every day when we rehearse our lives, when we rehearse the kind of parents and teachers and organizers that we want to be, that we are actually becoming that, right? You can't say, like, one day I want to be a good person. You actually have to rehearse that every day. So you can't say, one day I want to be free. You actually have to rehearse with yourself, with your community, with your children, what that might look like. So it's this idea that is not about the destination, but it's about the process as well. Of course, we want the destination to be an emancipatory future, but that can only happen if we take very seriously the day-to-day and what's happening around us every day, and the examples of freedom making that's happening behind bars, that's happening in land struggle, that's happening, over community kitchens that we can turn to. That these experiments are part of everyday life, and it's really attuning ourselves to that that I think can help us really, really dream in a different way about what it would mean, and practice that dream, to think about abolition, to think about human freedom. Yeah.
Next question from the audience. Don't be shy.
Good afternoon. Thank you, first of all, Robyn, for the fabulous reading. And thank you for the interview. It's been really interesting. I'm building on the first question, the person who asked the first question. It seems to me that on the one hand, letter writing is exceptionally intimate and personal, and that the addressee is the only one who, generally speaking, sees the letter and then responds to the letter in an equally intimate way. And so I'm wondering if you were trepidatious, you and or Leanne were trepidatious in any way about sort of coming out with these deeply personal letters. And then in relation to that, did you or have you both thought about audience and who your ideal audience for this book is, and what the book, I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to read it yet or even buy it yet.
It's not even out yet.
It's not, okay. I'm hoping to get it on Wednesday, Thursday. So I'm also wondering then what kind of space you are both hoping that the book will create, and what kinds of conversations it might open. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Darcy. So we've actually had some conversations about this, about who the book is to and who the book is for and who we're accountable to in many different stages as it was going forward. And I think I can speak for myself by saying the first accountability and the first audience for the book was Leanne, right? It was taking very seriously, having deep respect for Leanne as an intellectual, as a friend, as this incredible writer, of really wanting to do justice to articulating to her my concerns, the places that I saw possibility, and really just taking seriously that relationship and what it means to sort of be ethically accountable to this person who, the book is so much in communication and in communion with. So I'd say the first audience was Leanne. It was a very intimate act of letter writing in which she was who I was writing to at this time. But I think the next, if you could think of it sort of like an onion, then the next level would be to the communities that we're embedded in, right? So I think about the book as accountable to radical Black communities and thinkers, to the social movements that I've been so fortunate to be a part of, to people who are working against policing, against incarceration, for Black liberation and justice, for young Black people, for Black elders, so thinking about our communities sort of largely conceived as the second audience. And then the third, if you go outward from there, then I think anybody who's interested in thinking about freedom and anybody who's interested in thinking about how we could perhaps live in a world without racism, without gross economic injustice, for people who are, worried like I was when I started the book about the state of the planet, about the climate crisis, for people who just are questioning, perhaps could we live differently? Perhaps could we order our society differently? So I think those are sort of the three levels of people for whom I want the book to speak to the most. And I think that third group is growing all the time and expanding. So I guess I'm hoping that it might help contribute to a very large body, of work and thinking that is about reimagining, and not just imagining, but redoing and doing differently the kind of society we live in, moving away from, a society in which so many people have been made expendable and discardable, in which the planet has been made expendable and discardable. So I think there is a broader awakening that's happening all around us, and I just hope to sort of be a part of what that might look like, to be a part of that conversation, to contribute what's helpful, to help show some of that other work that is happening, and to lift up some of those other voices that have been about rethinking, about reordering, about thinking about a world beyond colonization, beyond policing, right? So I know that's sort of a large answer to the question, but that's really, who I was thinking about, who I'm still thinking about. And I think there are little parts of it that might appeal, to different kinds of audiences. But I think there are a lot of people from many walks of life thinking about freedom right now. So, yeah. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, it's really great to finally hear you in person, Robyn. And I wonder if there were any aha moments for you in thinking about anti-Black racism and indigeneity. And you mentioned about the planet being disposable. And I also see that as in colonialism, the planet, what we've been doing to the planet is very disabling. So I'd just like to hear any thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something, thank you for that. I think that's one of the central themes of the book, is to think about what kind of logics, what kind of ways of thinking and knowing made possible this massive pillaging of the planet and the people on the planet. What are the histories? What kind of history can help us make sense of this? So something that we do in the beginning of the book is actually trying to reframe what's often called the human-made crisis of the climate crisis, which is often tied to industrial revolution, and say this wasn't humans broadly, but it was actually a small and very powerful faction of humans who decided to enslave large swaths of the population, to colonize the rest of the planet, and to actually make all land move it away from the ways that different indigenous societies all across the world had thought about as land, and make it only for the production of profit. And in doing so, of course, creating these apocalyptic events that are leading us to the climate crisis now. So something that I point out in my first letter to Leanne is that in the Caribbean, for example, Black people were treated as so expendably that, of course, they were dying, at the age of 20 due to being, enslaved in plantations. But also the soil in Barbados by the 17th century was already considered having been so used up because of the ways that the plantation slavery was using the land, that it was already depleting the soil to this large extent. So there's been a worldview that we can think about as a colonial worldview, as a worldview that's part of slavery and capitalism, and how a way of understanding the world that is actually about capturing people, capturing planets, about ordering and this violent hierarchy, right? And always taking. So to think about all the other ways that land has been thought of from indigenous communities, indigenous to here, in Africa, the different ways the anti-colonial struggle across the African continent was very much about thinking about land differently, right? We often think about the climate crisis as this white Western contemporary thing, but anti-colonial struggle was very much about trying to reclaim the forests and the soil and to reorganize land differently, right? So we can actually turn to so many different traditions of how we could organize life on this planet that are not about depletion and hoarding, but are actually very much about abundance and about collective abundance. So it's about not only sort of pointing the finger, which I think is important, at saying, actually, how did this crisis come to be, but also saying, how are other ways that we could have conceived of the world, because we're not the first to be grappling with this question, even if we're perhaps people in one of the most urgent times to be doing so. But there have been people trying to think about land and land use and organizing human societies in much more expansive and liberatory ways that we can turn to as well and not put so much of that pressure only on our shoulders, but see that we are standing on the shoulders of many generations of people who've tried to insist on doing something else and something more generative and something more livable. Thank you.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, maybe two, depending on if the questions are true and false. Those are shorter questions. No other questions? Okay, yep.
I have one in case no one else after this. Thank you for letting me hog the mic. I'm just thinking of an article that Dion Brand wrote that was published in the Toronto Star, maybe in 2022 at some point, or 2021, at some point in the pandemic, in which she said that up against this viral COVID-19 pandemic, Black people have been living in the ongoing pandemic of anti-Black violence. And that, for me, sort of set the tone of my COVID-19 experience and lockdown and personal experiences with anti-Black racism during the few times that I did go outside of my house. And so I'm just wondering, Robyn, if and how and what have been your strategies, and maybe even Leanne's, if this is a conversation that you've had, how have you found a way to find Black joy and or Indigenous joy and a kind of livingness, a kind of Black livingness, Black life for Black life?
Thanks so much for that question. That's something that I think drove, especially the writing of this book, most of all of my writing so far, was to turn, policing Black lives really turned my eye to sort of trying to show the intricacies of the levels in which state-sanctioned anti-Blackness has permeated our society and has done so for 500 years. I felt very important to do at the time, but what I wanted to do this time was to point to these structures, point to these histories, but also very much focus on, to use your words, this Black livingness, this Black joy, what it means to live over and against this kind of, 500 years of organized violence. And that's something that's very much part of the book, that's celebrating the kind of movements that we were seeing all around us. We not only lived through a pandemic in 2020, but we lived through one of the largest uprisings, Black-led but multiracial, all across North America, where statues of enslavers were thrown in the sea, where a police station was burned in Minneapolis, where people were really drastically coming together to reimagine a different society, and doing so together, doing so loudly, doing so incredibly courageously. And that's something that was incredibly inspiring to see and to live through over and against even a time of gross state abandonment, in which, Black people, again, were experiencing the pandemic in ways that were so much more acute, not being able, for the large part, to stay home, being put in those essential work positions, whether in agricultural work or in factory work and in other ways, right? But to look at, despite those conditions, that it was Black people really on the front lines of living, of trying to demand freedom and taking enormous risks in order to do so. It was also a very powerful year of Indigenous land defense. Right before the pandemic was the Wet'suwet'en struggle that was happening through January and and even before, right? So we can look at that even in times of, and perhaps especially in times of acute unfreedom, we see people waging freedom that's expansive and not only for themselves, but for human society, right? The idea that this movement was something that was about freeing people, even if it was about black people as well, right? That it's about reimagining society, and I think that's something that's so crucial. But also, we talk about gardening, our kids running. There's so much, for me, this was a much more personal experience of writing than I've ever done, where it's really about how we're talking to our children about what's happening. How do I tell my son we're trying to make sure that people can come home from prison and go to and be with their families, because we're living through a pandemic and nobody should have to be in a cage ever, but especially not in a public health crisis. And how do I talk to my son about what that work is? Because I want him to know who I am, and I want him to know why I'm in a Zoom meeting, during his lunch hour at school, right? So there was really that profound, I think, a personal way for both of us in the text that's thinking about ourselves, our families, our communities, as well as looking much more broadly outwards in terms of people waging that struggle all around the world and taking risks to try to create something that perhaps, a planet that perhaps we can all survive on. So thank you for that.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes. I don't know if there's enough time for a very quick question. Probably not, eh? Yeah. So I ask if you'd join me in thanking Robyn for this very generous hour that we spent together. And on behalf of Word on the Street, I'd like to thank you for attending this event on the main stage. Thanks to our accessibility sponsor, Another Story Bookshop, for their generous contribution. And thanks also for being here in real life. A lot of Word on the Street has been online for the last couple of years, as many of you will know. There will still be online events, but also watch for the upcoming pop-up event at Evergreen Brickworks in September. Thank you very much for coming.